Okay, well, thank you for joining us this morning. It's sure to be an interesting and informative debate about creating inclusive communities. I'm Shawn Briley, the Coronado Library Director, and this event is part of the Community Read project, which this year is focusing on the book Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram Kendi. So all the participants in today's expert panel have strong backgrounds in service or advocacy within the community. And we're joined by County Supervisor Nora Vargas, who was elected to the County Board of Supervisors this past November, representing District 1, and it's more than 630,000 residents. Also with us today is Genevieve Jones-Wright, who represents Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, which is a litigation organization that works to hold government accountable, in particular to the disenfranchised. Shawn McClondon is the founder of the Sister Cities Project, a program that partners underserved minority communities with affluent white communities to build relationships and deepen cultural understanding. And Dr. David Miller is a professor at the University of San Diego, where he teaches a history of race in San Diego and race and ethnicity in the American experience. Today's moderator is Dr. Carl Luna. Dr. Luna is a frequent commentator on politics for both national and international media, including KPBS, and is San Diego Fox 5's resident political analyst. Dr. Luna is co-chair of Restoring Respect, a community initiative promoting greater civility in San Diego. So many of you will be watching a stream of this discussion. However, if you're joining us live by Zoom today, you can submit questions for the panel via chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end if there's an opportunity. So thank you for joining us today. Dr. Luna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shawn, and thank you, panelists, for joining us today, and thank you to our audience. This is an important conversation because building inclusive communities is critical to the future of this society. We just came off of January 6th, culminating the most tumultuous election, at least since 1968, if not since the 19th century. We're more divided as a nation than we've been at any point really in the last 40, 50 or more years. Meanwhile, we have, by zoning laws, by moving, by self-selection, we're living in even more segregated communities with less diversity than we had in some cases back in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, how do we build in 2021, 2022, and the 2020s inclusive communities, particularly when so many people are living in non-inclusive communities, but deriving at least some benefit from it? Otherwise, they wouldn't be living there. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists, but not, instead of having everybody answer the same question, I'll build on those to follow-ups with the other panelists, and then we'll get to audience Q&A, as Shawn said. As I receive them, I'll filter them into the conversation. I'd like to start with Supervisor Vargas. Nora, how do we build, particularly against San Diego, where there's a big difference between north of Miramar and south of I-8, how do you build an inclusive San Diego?
Well, thank you so much for that question, and good morning to all the panelists. It's my privilege to be here today. It's the reason why I ran. It's the reason why so many of us have done the work on the ground, right? We have to first acknowledge that we have a problem, that racism is real, that the inequities of this system is not just something that happened overnight. I mean, I think, many of us and many of the folks who are on this panel today can attest that so many of us have been trying to break down barriers for years. And I think we're finally getting the attention that we deserve, but it's still, representation matters. Allocating resources matters. Really, when you're talking about inclusivity, is really working together and strategically aligning ourselves to really a common goal, which is ensuring that the resources are expanded through our communities. And it can't just be done, I think, by government alone. I think it has to be done in partnership with community and elevating communities, not telling people what to do, but meeting people where they're at and hearing about what we need to do to be able to move things forward. I mean, I sit here as the first Latina, the first woman of color, the first immigrant, the first person to be bilingual on the board, right? With that comes a lot of responsibility. And in addition to that, I think it's not just, being there and being excited about being there, it's really shaking things up And I can assure you, I mean, I could tell you this is week 7 for me. And people are not used to the questions that I'm asking, right? And it can, you know, I've created allies that I'm working with to be able to change things, but you have a system that has been ingrained and has been, you know, doing things one way for many, many years. And I think we're behind. We're behind a lot, particularly in the county. And we have created, you know, policy, right? So addressing racism as a public health care issue, looking at health equity around COVID and vaccines, but it's not happening fast enough. And so I guess what I would say is we really have to come together to address some of these challenges, calling them out and creating solutions to be able to address them.
And Shawn, building on what Nora's been saying, your work with Sister Cities and others have been toward building diverse and inclusive communities, cohesive, inclusive communities. You know, we've got, I think, a good idea about what inclusive is supposed to mean, but how do you build cohesive communities with all the history we have of creating exclusive, non-inclusive communities? I mean, these non-exclusive communities are cohesive. How do you broaden them up?
Well, for me, it all starts with taking a step back. You know, Nora talked a lot about the different policies on her level and different things that we have to change. I really think it starts with just a discussion, two people building relationships. What I see in San Diego is that when you talk about this divide, you know, obviously there aren't a lot of people that are talking, that are getting to know people of color. So, for example, with Sister Cities, one of the little things that we do is we actually take residents from Solana Beach and you know, Encinitas, and we go down to Southeast San Diego and we go down to City Heights and we have conversations with the residents there. You know, my whole thing is I think about the ripple effect, which is if two people build a relationship that are from very different communities, that has a ripple effect with other people. It has a ripple effect within their family. So I think really, although there are some big things that we need to do, some big changes that we need to make, I really would like to see more programs and more organizations and more large corporations and companies starting to actually reach out and actually not just have the, you know, panel discussions, which are a step and it's fantastic, but also really sit down with people and start to have discussions and start building, trying to actively build relationships with people that are different from them.
Yeah, and Genevieve, building on what Shawn was saying, you need to establish relationships. To achieve relationships, you have to have mutual understandings, you have to have mutual experience. How do we build that with the backdrop of hundreds of years of entrenched isolation and exclusivity, of racism? I mean, how do we build these difficult conversations, particularly when we have been sorting ourselves into somewhat antagonistic camps?
Thank you so much for that question. And I really am honored to be a part of this conversation because I can't underscore it enough. And Shawn said it, Nora said it. These types of conversations are very critical to us moving forward. To answer your question specifically, I say that one of the causes of this discordance in our communities is there is no sense of commonality. There's no real sense of us having a shared humanity. And when you talk about where we came from, we have to understand that slavery was a part of this country before this country was even a country. And so there's deeply embedded racism, white supremacy, and I believe that we have to call things out as we see them. But as we call things out, we also have to call people in and do it all in love. We have to stop the othering of one another. And this goes back to this sense of commonality and shared humanity. I'm reading the book Caste right now, and it really drives home the point that race is made up, but we've made it real through our norms, through our structures, and specifically through the structural racism that is perpetuated in our systems. And so in order to create these inclusive communities that we're here talking about, we have to be very intentional about it. And we also have to simply call out things. Nora said it in the beginning, we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge not just where we are, but how we got here. For me, after the January 6th attacks and the insurrection at the nation's capital, that attempted coup, I heard and I saw a lot of statements from public and elected officials, from organizations, and all of the statements condemned the violence. But no one denounced white supremacy, which is actually what begat the violence. And it's how we got here in the first place. And so we have to have these conversations. And we started to have the conversation as a country with the killing of George Floyd. And I always see the opportunity in those types of tragedies. We're also seeing the opportunity in the tragedy that has been coronavirus here in this country. But we have to have the conversations around why there are two pandemics that we are under, one being the coronavirus and then also racism. And so now we're having those conversations. And so these types of conversations we're engaging in today are all important. And these are the conversations we have to have. These are the hard conversations, but this is how people connect. And it really has to be on a very personal level. And we've got a dialogue. I can't underscore that enough.
Yeah, and I think you put your finger directly on something there, Genevieve, when you're talking about the need to be able to recognize these things. But in America today, as soon as you bring up the legacy of racism, you tend to get kind of a backlash to it about to bring up racism is to somehow be racist. I was going to take that over to David from a historical perspective. The book that for Coronado reads is Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he proposes a standard definition for racism. My definition of a racist idea is a simple one, he writes. It's any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. That shouldn't be such a hard idea to debate and discuss in America. But how do we address 400 years of pathologies of racism, as Genevieve was pointing out, without reinforcing racial division and political polarization, without the backlash of white supremacy, etc.?
It's a great question. And if I had the answer, you could all give me the Nobel Prize. I think that we have to understand that racist ideas historically in the United States serve a purpose and have served a purpose. And that is to regulate the boundaries of authority and power. Because from the very beginning, we have to know, as Genevieve pointed out, the institution of slavery and the beginning of the African slave system, the arrival of colonists, built up in that history was a new system we call race, the construction of these ideas of race, and they always served a purpose, which was to maintain systems of power and authority. So I think to get at conversations about race, we always have to bear in mind that it's going to be hard for some people to do, because by breaking down those ideas, they're breaking down what the structures of privilege, of their power, of their authority. And so I think that I think it's the onus is on white people to take a hard look at themselves and to say, okay, what is this history? How does it perpetuate and create boundaries of power and authority? What conversations do I need to have? What books do I need to read? What do I need to learn? So that we can then get beyond what Kendi says is just sort of not being racist, because his other book, of course, is How to Be Anti-Racist, and to take it that next step and to say, it's not just that I'm not contributing to something, or that I'm going to have apathy and step back and not be a part of the conversation, but that I'm going to actively, as a verb, right, go out and do something to oppose this system of power that racist ideas enforce and reinforce. And I think that the first step to that, and everyone's already said it, so I just echo them, it's not my idea, is you got to call it out and you got to name it. The book Cast, in it, and I actually just assigned this portion to my students, Wilkerson talks about, she uses an analogy of an old house. You could use religion, you could use healthcare, you could use sports. In most aspects of our lives, we are not willing to just accept a problem and turn a blind eye to it and move on. We always want to diagnose it, right? If you live in an old house and there's leaky pipes, you don't just ignore the leaky pipes, you figure it out. If you have cancer, you got to get in there and figure out where it comes from. If your team lost, you go back and look at the game tape. But yet with issues of race, people don't want to look at it, right? We have the receipts, we have the game tape, we can show you exactly where the problem is. And in every other aspect of our life, we're willing to talk about it. But for some reason with the issue of race, people want to step away. They want to say, well, it's not a problem. I'm colorblind. I'm going to walk away. And so that, I think, is the key, is we got to get people to see it and to recognize it, to see how it polices power and authority, and then to actively work against it.
I don't know, Carl, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, so the challenge with that is that it's, you know, some people have the privilege of being able to not talk about race. I don't have that privilege, and I'm a white Latina, right? Look at me, I'm not a dark Latina. So I already have privileges on top of, you know, that other people don't have in my community. And I learned a lot from serving on the Southwestern College Governing Board, and what it meant to be, you know, a majority of Latinos, and having to have that conversation of addressing anti-Blackness on our campus and even within our own communities, right? I started having conversations about what that looked like. And, you know, some of us get tired because we don't have the privilege of not being a person of color, right? I don't have the privilege of stepping off and saying, I'm not an immigrant, I'm not binational, I'm not bicultural. What you're doing, what you're saying is hurting my people. So I think the policy piece around that is that what we're teaching in our schools is not the right history, right? What our system, where we're allocating the resources, is not shifting, you know, how we have these conversations. And so I agree, we have to do this with love and we have to work together. But I also think that we have to shake the system down, because it was a system that wasn't created by us or for us. And one person can't do it alone, and it has to be in partnership, because we can't wait any longer, right? And I don't want to dominate the conversation around COVID and vaccines, but look at the data, right? Look at the data. The first phase is healthcare workers. Our people are not healthcare workers. They're not the ones have those jobs, and they're not the ones that are getting the vaccines. And the CDC and the decision makers are not seeing how that is really, and there's inequity in how healthcare has impacted our communities. And so, you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but I want to make sure we highlight that it has to also be systemic change, and it's not going to happen overnight, and we have to keep pushing.
And I'm building on that. And again, any panelists, if any of you have any ideas, please just bring them in. This is an organic conversation. It's in my lifetime, since George Wallace in the 1960s, there's been a backlash against desegregation, against acknowledging racism. And it's always kind of befuddled me, because white population was here, the African-American was there, and the white population's gone up, African-American has tried to catch up. You would think that's a win-win, but there's a strong tendency, as Thomas Piketty points out in his book, Ideology, for ruling elite to justify why they are the elite, and why others should be subordinate to them. And anything that challenges that, they see a challenge to power. And there's also a basic human thing, that if I'm up here and I'm going up, but you're catching up, somehow I'm losing my position in the pack. People like having their feeling of being better than somebody. How do you address things like COVID, where you would try to address populations that aren't getting the healthcare they want without the populations that are feeling threatened? I think that's what drives a lot of this problem. And again, anybody who does solve this, I am writing in my Nobel Peace Prize nominations.
Well, Carl, I'll just jump in really quickly, because that is a very real problem. And I'll give you a real life example that I came across last week. Supervisor Nathan Fletcher of our Board of Supervisors, obviously of San Diego County, had posted that there was a new initiative that the county was launching in order to address the disproportionate rates of Black maternity and Black infant rates. What I saw coming from community members was an insertion of themselves and saying, well, what about my group? What about me? And we have to understand that when we talk about inequities, we are talking about how one group is doing worse off than someone else and what is needed in order to address the inequities. And that's just one example. And so, and I, you know, I'm going to bring up Caste again because it's a wonderful book, and I would say read it if you can. But the structure that we have in this country really does deepen the division between everyone on the rungs, as Isabel Wilkerson talks about. So it's not just that you're at the top of the ladder, it's everyone in between. If everyone knows who the person is on the bottom, then they will treat that group accordingly in order to self-preserve. And those are my words there for the self-preservation, because somewhere along the line, we got white supremacy and racism deeply embedded in every single system. And we have to come to a place in this country where we get away from saying, this is not America, this is not who we are, when it is exactly who we are. This has been America from her very inception. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we have to understand that no system is exempt. Healthcare, which is how we have so many inequities for people of color. We can look at the data right here in San Diego County. People of color are suffering at higher risk of having cases, of dying, of being hospitalized because of COVID-19. And what COVID has shown us is that the inequities have been magnified. It hasn't revealed new information. It has just magnified the inequities that we're facing in our communities. But we can talk about the racism that's deeply at the root of our political systems, our education systems, all of our systems here in America. And we have to talk about why we want to talk about equality and not equity. And some people genuinely confuse the terms, but we have to educate people about it. And some people just want to make things equal and not address inequities. And we really have to do that. And if we're talking about building inclusive communities, equity has to be at the core and at the base of that.
Yeah, and that becomes the issue, though. Even getting some people, one of the questions from an audience member, to even acknowledge systemic racism, because there's the pushback. Somehow, if I acknowledge it, I'm responsible for it, and I lose something to it. I mean, San Diego has a very long, deep, and often unremarked on history of not just systemic racism, but actually political extremism. Tom Metzger back in the 1970s. We've had to look at the correlations between San Diegans and the insurrection in Washington. Can we really get a good dialogue going on a countywide basis between East County and coastal San Diego, between North County and Southern San Diego, when people don't even see each other on a daily basis from those different areas? Shawn, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it comes to me, and I talk to a lot of people about this, again, to take a step back. I always look at, I always think about having courage. I think a lot of what we're talking about here, you know, starting the conversation, you know, you're talking about, Carl, you're talking about the pushback that people get when they start the conversation. I think that you have to have a little bit of courage to be able to have that conversation, to want to have that conversation, to start the conversation. And when I talked about, you know, companies and you know, different people. So an example, you know, I talked to a group last night that's very interested in moving this conversation forward. And it was a group of mainly, you know, white individuals that really want to do something. They're good-hearted people. They really want to make a change. They really want to help. But I think a lot of times, you know, we talk about these conversations and it gets uncomfortable for people. And I think as soon as it gets uncomfortable, and I think, you know, Nora talked about how, you know, you know, certain people, it gets uncomfortable. And I think people just don't want to move forward because they don't want to look at the actual, you know, the actual problem. They don't want to look at everything that's going on. So I think if people just, you know, whatever we're doing, we just need to show a little bit of courage to move this conversation forward.
Yeah, and as we build these conversations, I mean, David, across our history, we've gone through periods like this. You had the Civil War and the abolitionists abolished slavery, then you got the blowback of Reconstruction. You had the Progressive Era, and then you went into a conservative, isolationist, anti-immigrant period. We did the Great Society in the 1960s. It ushered in the neoconservative blowback to that and where we are today. Do you think that we do have a pathway toward a good step forward with these conversations in the near term, or is this something that's going to take a new generation to come of age and power and put the older generation, my generation, out to pasture? Is this what's the time frame that we can really get these conversations going, do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough question. One of the lessons of history, unfortunately, is that racism, and in particular white supremacy, is very malleable. And just when you think you're starting to get a new generation or you're making progress, it changes, it morphs, it goes different places, and it reemerges. And so I am not of the historical opinion that this is just going to get better over time, or that a new generation will simply solve the problems. That said, it's going to require work, right? If Frederick Douglass teaches us anything, it's that power never concedes without a demand. You have to agitate, agitate, agitate. And that's indeed how any of these changes have happened. What I do see with my own students, though, in the time that I've been at USD, is a sea change in attitude. Their starting point is completely different than the starting point, that students had when I started back in 2005, or what I had when I was in college. And so there is a change that's happening, and demographics are changing in a way that's going to, in some cases, give minority groups majority voices. But that, again, in and of itself isn't sufficient, right? Black folks outnumbered white folks in South Carolina. That didn't mean they had a vote. And, so just the numbers themselves aren't enough. I think that what Kendi sees as a solution is getting those people, that new generation, not just to be educated and not just to have conversations, which is a starting point, but they have to be in those positions of power themselves. They have to be the district attorneys and those county supervisors and the mayors and the school board officials and the librarians and the presidents and the senators. And once they're in those positions of power, then they can use that power to break down. So, I mean, if I'm looking for a prognosis, I don't think anything's inevitable, but it's going to be a while. I think there's a lot of work to do. And I would just add one more thing to the conversation I think is important. I think that one of the reasons I think that white people have a hard time talking about this is because it's easy to see historically the explicit racism, right? I mean, clearly slavery is bad. Clearly Jim Crow is bad. And they forget that although those explicit forms of legally sanctioned racial inequality ended in the 1960s, the harm that they did certainly didn't end. The language of racism then went somewhere else. And so it's harder to identify for a lot of people. So when Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the moderate white being a problem, that's what he's talking about. He's saying the folks who don't think that there's a problem, who don't see it. And I know a lot of the folks out there in the audience are asking that question. How do you convince those moderates, right? Those people who want to be colorblind or want to sort of avoid the problem. How do you convince them? Having a conversation with a white nationalist is one thing, but I think we have to remember that what we need to do is figure out how to bridge that moderate who really doesn't think that there's a problem, because they don't see it in the same way that you would have seen it, like you pointed out, in the 1800s or in the early 1900s, et cetera.
Yeah, David, that kind of builds on what Nora was pointing out about the inequities in healthcare and the response to COVID. Look how we're distributing vaccines. We prioritized healthcare workers. Well, if you look at who the healthcare workers in America with degrees, doctors, and the rest, that's a different portion of the population. Teachers, professionals, they always tend, my peeps, always tend to be toward the front of the line, but that's supposed to be based on merit. Now, we've developed a meritocracy that says, hey, if you're doing well, you must have done something to get there, which implies if you're not doing well, maybe that's on you. The solution is always to bring more people into the meritocracy, but the top 20% is the top 20%, no matter how you're going to slice and dice it. How do we transcend that feeling amongst many people that, well, yeah, the other person's racist, but what I have, I basically earned and deserved? Anybody jump in on that?
Well, I will.
Genevieve?
And I do also want to say, Carl, to your last question, that I think our county has started the conversation you referenced. having the conversation around the county, and Supervisor Vargas can definitely speak on this and expound on this, but the County Board of Supervisors declaring racism a public health crisis, I believe, began the conversation. And again, that is what is necessary. A lot of people were triggered by that designation, and it allowed for conversations to take place that would not have taken place. But it is a fact, it needed to be said, and it allowed for people to come to the table and say, hold on, that's a bit strong. What do you mean by that? And then people started to have the conversation. So I did want to say that. As to this particular question, I think that when we start to talk about white privilege or how people have benefited from racist systems and structural racism, a lot of people say, well, I wasn't alive during that time, or my family didn't own slaves. And what we have to understand is that some of the privileges that come with whiteness extends to you regardless of you being a direct actor. You are still a direct beneficiary. I live in a home in Southeast San Diego that I would not have been able to buy years back because of redlining in the city of San Diego, because of how they would draw communities. And which is why my grandparents lived in the area that they lived in, because they were restricted. We have to remember that because of certain covenants, Black people and Jewish people were not allowed to buy homes in La Jolla, for example. When you take a situation where a person is relegated to a particular part of an area, and we understand how certain areas get more resources, by the virtue of one group being able to buy property in La Jolla, another group having to buy in another area that is not given benefits, you are building more equity in that home in La Jolla, which allows for you to pull out equity to take your kids, send your kids to college. And we have to really think about how things like redlining contributes to generational wealth for other groups and cuts against that for other groups. And there are so many other examples we can give, but truly every person who benefits from white privilege benefits from the structures that have been in place through the systems that perpetuate white supremacy. And so that's why we call for the undoing of things, the dismantling of these systems, but also equitable resources, access to services, and treatment.
I would just say, just to add on that, just for the historical perspective, we think oftentimes of that as being way back in the past. The Fair Housing Act passed in 1965. Don't forget, California attempted to pass the Fair Housing Act, and 2/3 of California voters vetoed it. So the federal government finally did that in 65. 1965 wasn't that long ago. And if you think about, right, and so if a Black family comes along in 1970, they're just now have a kid in maybe their 40s who could maybe inherit that wealth. So it's been one generation at best. And if you set that up against the preceding 350 years of US history, you're looking at 12.5%, 15% of US history relative to 85% of legally sanctioned racial inequality. And so I think that's something else that a lot of people forget, is that they think of it as way back in the past, and it's really not. It's really not that long ago. And then the last thing I'll throw out is we're talking about how do we get people to realize that, you know, racism is bad for everybody, which I think should be self-evident, right? Like, we all want the best team and the best people and everyone to have equality and opportunity. But I would argue that the folks who are benefiting from that perhaps really deep down don't want it. They talk about equality, they talk about equal opportunity, they talk about a fair playing field. These are white folks. But really, when they don't really want that challenge, they don't really want that competition, and they view it as a threat or a loss of something to themselves, when really it's something they've been advocating for all Americans, theoretically, right, in their political rhetoric since the 80s, since the 70s and 60s, really.
Yeah, go ahead, Shawn.
No,
Yeah, and that was somewhat the point I was making earlier. You know, my experience is really, you know, talking to, for example, I live in Solana Beach. So, you know, I always make the joke that I'm literally the only Black person in Solana Beach. But there are very few of us. And so I have, and a lot of people know me because I've been in the community. I've been You know, I've done many things in the community. And so I have a lot of conversations with community members. And, you know, honestly, what I see is that a lot of people, as much as, you know, the broader discussion is out there and we're starting to really look at these things, when I talk to people one-on-one, especially in like affluent communities, half of them don't even understand there's an issue. Most of them don't even know what systemic racism is, and they don't see it that way. So that's my concern, is that as much as I always made this joke, like, you know, I, for example, a lot of the work that I've done has been in Southeast San Diego, very underserved communities, you know, and so I would go to these, you know, discussions about race, and most of the audience would be minorities, right? So we're aware of all this stuff. We talk about this. We've had this type of communication, and then I would come to Solana Beach or Encinitas or Carlsbad, and they're not having these discussions. You know, I was one of the few people to start a discussion about these types of topics, only to realize that, and this was way before George Floyd, this was years before that, only to realize that no one was doing it.
Yeah.
So I think that there's this real disconnect, even with this conversation that we're having right now. There's a huge disconnect between people that are having the conversation and the people that don't have to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all across the nation.
And I love that. And I also want to just reiterate, you know, Jen's position or conversation around the self-preservation. I think many of us as groups, minority groups or communities of color, we've been pitted against each other. And so that benefits the people who are in privilege. And I mean, I can't tell you enough how much I listened when I was on the governing board of Southwestern College. And I think all of you know some of the challenges that we've had on our campus, and it's not perfect, but things have changed. But to be able to hear firsthand from folks, right? Like, you don't understand my experience because you haven't lived it. And really checking yourself, right? Even as a woman of color, to be able to say, well, oh shit, like there is racism, and we have some systems that are actually not helping the Black community on our campus. And no matter how much we're creating these policies around equity, it's not working. And you had a majority of Latinos on the board, and we had to check ourselves. And I think that's a hard thing to do, because most people, especially politicians and elected officials, don't want to check themselves and say, we have a problem and we need to address it head on. And there's a lot of hurt, and we're going to have to figure out how to do this together as we're moving forward. And I think, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I'll say this. I think the one thing that I have learned, you know, I was hesitant about doing the race as a public health care issue, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to be tokenized, right? I can't be tokenized. As the only woman of color on this board, I mean, Leon Williams was a great leader, former supervisor. I have big shoes to fill. My legacy will be a different one. But, you know, I look at this work and I said, okay, well, what does this actually mean, right? How are we actually going to hold people accountable? How are we going to make sure that we are creating partnerships to make sure that this is changing? We can't just be doing, you know, resolutions and taking pretty pictures. We actually have to figure out how we make systemic change. And so yesterday, you know, Andrew Strong was this week announced that he's going to be the new representative for Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And I said to someone, I think he's a perfect candidate for this, because he comes from the county, so he understands where some of these challenges are, and he can elevate those, right? But we have to figure out a way to hold people accountable, so it's not just about, you know, the picture or the resolution. It has to be around real data. And it doesn't mean, and this is the one thing that I've learned and I'm trying to work on better, is that just because my district only has 4% of African Americans, it doesn't mean that that's the percentage of resources that they should get, right? We have to get away from that. We're not going to change. The reason why you don't have more African Americans in my district is because it's not safe, because people don't have jobs, because they've had to move away, because they don't, it's not, you know, a safe place to be. And so we have to change that so that people understand. Just like we have welcoming cities for immigrants, we should have welcoming cities for our Black and African American communities as well, right? So that people understand that it's safe and that they can be productive and they can buy those houses and they can be here. And I think we can't do that if we don't do it together.
And Nora, you've reminded me of what was mentioned early on in this conversation about, the analogy to a house, that if you have leaky pipes, you're going to have to figure out how to fix them. But haven't we kind of done that as our county house, our national house, with racism, with inequity? I mean, we've got good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. How dare we? Aren't all of our neighborhoods supposed to be decent neighborhoods? Do you have one room of your house you say, oh, don't go into that room because it's really crime infested and it's really a lousy place to be? No, you're going to figure out a way to take out equity on the whole house to fix that, knowing it raises the value of the entire house. Talk about unsafe neighborhoods. If any neighborhood in San Diego is unsafe in the county, it's a failure of all of us when it comes to law enforcement. But how do we get that understanding? That, because the counter to it is, if there are bad neighborhoods and good neighborhoods, the people in the good neighborhoods deserve to live there. So there's something about the people in the bad neighborhoods, and you reach all that reinforced systemic problems. Again, that's, in my mind, one of the single biggest challenges we have to reconceptualize. How do we even begin that conversation without challenging people in the better neighborhoods' sense of self?
Oh, you know what I forgot to tell you? When we did declare racism as a public health care issue, I was going to declare white supremacy not acceptable in the county of San Diego. But I'm going to be honest with you. I got a little scared, and I'm very courageous, and people who know me know that I'm not afraid of a lot of people. But I got so much hate mail, and I used to work for Planned Parenthood, so I'm used to getting hate mail from people, right? I was the only Latina executive at Planned Parenthood, so I'm used to it. But the amount of hate that I got from and the emails and the texts that I got, it scared me a little. So I decided to refrain myself from doing, calling white supremacy, something that's not acceptable, because I decided not to get that attention on me because I rather make the change on the inside. So I'm saying this to you publicly because I want you to know that when you are the only person leading, it's really hard, because the amount of hate, the Ku Klux Klan is real in the county of San Diego. The KKK is real, and they have no problem coming after people like me or people who are going to be standing up. And I'm strong, I can handle it, but you also have to figure out what fights do you want to fight at this moment. And right now I'm fighting the COVID fight and the equity fight on vaccines. But I think, it's not acceptable that people think that that's freedom of speech to attack, even if you're an elected official, being racist and attacking someone because they're calling out something that's real should not be acceptable. And it is in this county.
Yeah, and follow up from the other panelists.
I would just say that, again, I don't do this sort of the community work on the ground that the other folks here do. So I'll give them obviously those answers. But I think that historically, one of the lessons from history is that Americans from day one, and I'm talking back to the Naturalization Act of 1790 that declared in order to become a naturalized citizen of the United States, one of the prerequisites was you had to be white. I mean, white is literally the floor model American. So that for 400 years, that becomes the ideal imagined community. And I think that, to your question, Carl, about how do you get people to recognize that there's a problem, to see that there's a problem? We have to get all Americans to see each other, to see ourselves in each other. And we're fighting an uphill battle because for most of US history, that hasn't included non-white people. And so it's hard, I think, for some, and I'll say, I mean, it's hard for them to imagine us all as being all Americans, as all San Diegans, as all part of the same community. W.E.B. Du Bois, when he was receiving all kinds of criticism for his Black history of Reconstruction, he wrote a scathing critique of the history of Reconstruction written by white men. And he said, the fundamental problem that these historians have is that they cannot conceive of Negroes as men. They're not even starting from the position of humanity. They're not even starting from the position that we're all somehow a part of this. And I think that that's got to be one of the first steps. And how exactly you do that, I leave to everybody else. But it gets back to conversations, sharing each other's stories, experiences, interacting, I don't know how you stop the Klan with that. I'm not suggesting that at all. I don't think you're going to talk the Klan out of their stuff. But for the folks who don't see that there's a problem, they need to see that someone else's problem is their problem, because that other person is them. We're all a part of this, and we all are better off if we solve the problem.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Nora, I'm that's unfortunate that happened to you, because I feel like that's somewhat the playbook, right? We move this conversation forward. There are leaders that step out front, and like Genevieve said, you have to call it out. But as soon as you call it out, there are certain people that are going to beat you back. And I think one of the things that I've seen starting the organization that I've started, because Sister Cities Project, one of the things we want to do is we want to specifically focus on the relationship between Black and white people. And what I've seen as I've done this with other organizations that started right around George Floyd, based on the unequal treatment of Black people, have started to take that platform and say, okay, well, we have to broaden it, because we're getting pushback from a lot of people about just saying that, this country is unequal for Black people. And I think, unfortunately, to me, like, slavery in this country was the original sin. And it is the hardest conversation, the hardest discussion is had to have when you're talking about white supremacy. Anytime you call out that fight, that discussion, people want to beat you back. And when I was talking about courage, I'm not pointing any fingers or saying anything, but I think, somehow, some way, we have to continue to push that fight, because I feel like it's the one fight in America that has to end. And I think that if we can get equality for Black people, then everyone else benefits, right? Humankind benefits, Hispanics benefit, everyone benefits, because it's the one in America that's the toughest. So I just find it unfortunate, and I hope that you obviously continue that fight, because we all have to. It's time. It needs to be done and over with.
I am surprised to have heard that, Nora, that the intensity of the blowback. And I think while we're having this conversation, which is generally about people of goodwill, talking about how do you talk to other people of goodwill, I think as a society, we have to have a more robust conversation about the people of ill will who are willing to go to great lengths, look what happened on January 6th, to subvert the conversation for their own power. But I think that becomes a conversation for another day. I got a question from one of our audience members talking about what your view is on the role of the private sector, San Diego corporations, to take a leadership role in trying to dismantling this beyond changing up the board members and higher management. How do you really reach into your customer base to establish a different mindset of how you should behave? Any examples you had or experience you may have had?
Well, I could say, I'll say that it shouldn't have to be legislated, or policy shouldn't have to be created, right? I served on CalSTRS, right, the largest teacher pension board in the nation. Because of that, we were shareholders, and we were able to, I served on the diversity. I was vice chair of organizational, what we were doing in terms of accountability for CEOs and executives, and trying to create these pipelines, right? How do you make sure you get enough women and women of color and people of color onto their corporate boards? I think they're not doing enough, and they get away with it. They get away with it by having one, person who is a vice president of DEI, right? Or one person in these jobs. And what we're not doing is, we have to do more of investing in communities and making sure, and it's not just one grant, right? It's really going back and figuring out how do they support the elected officials who are going to make the change, right? They're part of the problem, to be honest. And I think that we have an opportunity to hold people accountable and say, we need to do right by our communities. And it can't just be, I think somebody said on their comments, right? It can't just be, again, the picture and the flyer on Black History Month or Latino History Month, or, it has to go beyond that. You have to change the culture internally. And that's not going to change until we are actually looking at the numbers. And when people are in these roles, making sure that they have the support that they need, right? It's not just having an executive. I've been the first executive at a whole bunch of different places. And the only time I really feel I was successful is when I had the resources and the coaches and the support to be able to do the work and the systemic change that no longer I was responsible for it, but my white colleagues were also responsible for that. And having leaders who have the courage, who don't look like me, to be able to put that as a priority is, I think, where a lot of these efforts have to go. I think I can't speak for my colleagues on the panel, but I will say, as people of color who end up being the first at a lot of different things, we end up having to be the only voices, and that can't be the norm anymore. We have to change that so that different perspectives are at the table, but that our decision makers in terms of budgets and resources and building leadership and building those pipelines, and it's not happening right now.
Yeah, comments from anybody?
Well, I agree with everything that Nora said, and I do think that representation matters, and I do believe that even with these private corporations, there is a duty there, and you have to bring impacted people to the table of decision making. So again, there should be representation in higher levels and management, and it shouldn't be tokenized. It should be real inclusion and diversity at all levels. As it relates to policies that private corporations make, those policies should be informed by the people who are impacted the most. I always say to corporations when they ask me what they can do, because corporations have now started to engage in this conversation, and I say, have some introspection. Go back and look at how you have benefited from structural or systemic racism. How has your company benefited from that? And then make amends. I believe very deeply in reparations. I also believe very deeply in stopping pay wage gap, where you are paying people of color less than their white counterparts. Make that right and pay them reparations for the back pay that you owe them for all of the time where you weren't paying them accordingly. And these are the things that is incumbent upon everyone in this country. Shawn talked about slavery being at the heart of things and why the focus on Black people is very important. And I do want to just talk about that for a second. I think a lot of people don't realize that Black people were never given reparations. After African people were stolen and their culture was stolen, language, families separated, their humanity was stripped from them for years and years and decades, there was never reparations given to Black people. But reparations were made to the people who owned people as chattel property. And we have to let that sink in. There has not been the amends that need to be made in this country as it relates to that very dark part of our history. And going back to something that David said, when we talk about how do we get people there, the opportunity that I talked about in my beginning comments was the opportunity that I do see with the tragedy of George Floyd, because we were able to see at a higher level folks who didn't understand that there were two Americas. They didn't know that there were two Americas. They were blind to that. They didn't understand what people of color had been saying about police brutality until they saw it with their own eyes. And then they started to see that police interact with Black men differently. They interact with Black children differently. And it is through those types of lenses that we have to give to people who don't understand. And it comes through conversations sometimes, but sometimes it comes through just the sheer examples. And I see the opportunity of COVID, because I don't know that the killing of George Floyd would have had this impact. We saw protests in all 50 states and all over the world where people were saying, hey, Black Lives Matter. We have been dealing with police brutality and police killings of Black people for years and years and years. And it was through us not being able to be out and about, socializing the way that we would, where we had to tune in. We saw it. It was everywhere. It was on the news. It was on social media, and we weren't able to turn away. And so we had this opportunity to show the other America, the experiences of the other America, and now we're seeing progress being made. And the last thing that I will say is that we really have to talk in the way that King talked about it, that all of our destinies are tied together. And that's the only way that we are going to move, because we recognize that when you suffer an injustice, I too suffer an injustice. When you get equality and you get equitable treatment, then I am better off for that as well.
Yeah, and building on that to take us to a conclusion, I see we lost Shawn, but I think he has an internet thing. He's going to be coming back as soon as he can. We've looked at the history of where we've been in America, talking about how we got to where we are now. We've been discussing where we are now, but the goal is always to get to where you want to be. Where do you see, when we're trying to build inclusive communities in San Diego, what would be the model you'd be looking for? If we're successful over the next decade, by the 2030s, what would these inclusive, cohesive communities look like? And what do you see in San Diego today as the closest model to where we want to be? I'm going to start with David.
Well, just real quick, two things. One is I would say, yeah, the lesson of history is this is not inevitable. When Americans found themselves in crisis back in the day, that we now look back on and say, well, that worked itself out. No, it didn't work itself out. People made it work out. And we're in that moment now, whether it's with COVID and police, brutality and systemic racism. We have to make the choices. So then the question is, how do we do that? On a policy level, that's harder for me to answer as an historian. But I will say an example that I see, at least in my own world, is at the San Diego History Center. The San Diego History Center is the purview historically of privileged white people telling privileged white histories. And we're trying to break that door down. And when you invite people into that space, and we see it with Kumeyaay community. We see it with partnerships in the South Bay to tell Latino and Latinx histories. We see it with the new Black History Initiative, inviting folks from the community in to tell their stories and to share their experiences and to create that history. And what I think it does, hopefully, is it allows anyone who comes to the San Diego History Center to realize this is the whole history of San Diego. Yes, they're separate. Yes, they're different. Yes, there's been inequalities. But at the end of the day, my story is our story. And so that's what I see. It's basically, it's people in power cashing that power and privilege in to then create opportunity for other folks to come in. And in my case, share their histories. And in other places, obviously, it'd be sharing other resources.
Genevieve, how about for you? What would San Diego look like if we're successful in reaching these goals by 2030? And where are we doing it best? What parts of the city do you find to be the most inclusive communities today?
I don't know that I can give a part of the city that is doing it really well and would be a good model. But I can say that there is a group in Coronado that I adore, and it's called Inclusionado. And I love it because of the wordplay and what it means. And this is a group of concerned Coronado residents who formed together to, and you know what, I'll just use their words. These people are so powerful in their mission, understanding that children are our future. They acknowledge that they have failed to instill them with an appreciation of diversity. And when you fail to do that, you fail to prepare them for the world they will inherit. That is powerful stuff. So while I can't say this area is a good model for that, I can point to that powerful group and say that that's what we all should be talking about. And that's how we all should be talking. And I am just, every time I hear about the work that they're doing to dismantle the racism in the school system and how they are promoting inclusion. And I think every city should have an Inclusionado, but make it your own. This one is perfect for Coronado. And I think that that really just gets to the heart of how to build inclusive communities, understanding where the lack is and saying, this is what we need to do to address the lack. And then the final thing that I will say about this is, in order to have inclusive communities, no matter where we are, if that's our goal, we have got to be dedicated to it, and it has to be intentional.
And Nora, you have the last word for us today.
You know, I will say intentionality with resource allocation and policy shift, I think has to be how we do this together. I think when we build coalitions to move our our agendas forward, I think is when we're successful. And when we have done it is usually when we're in crisis. And so what I would like us to do more is to do it strategically, to come together and begin to own our power and use our power. Because if I'm sitting here, Genevieve has power, right? Because I am her. She through me can make changes. And I think that's where we're gonna have to figure out how to own that power and be able to mobilize and use it. Where I think it has worked, I don't think, particularly in District 1, I think there is still a lot of work to be done, I'll say, because there is, a lot of issues that we have to address as a community, particularly around anti-Blackness in the Latino community, even though there is a large population of folks who are Black in the Latino community, but we don't, we don't talk about it. And I think it's important to have that conversation. I have seen the students at Southwestern College, when they build a coalition government, do a really good job, but that only came after crisis. And so I think we have to get better at forming coalitions and being able to build so that we can really, challenge what we know as institutional racism that is real, and we have to continue to do that work. And I'm not sure that I can dismantle racism in the county of San Diego in 4 years or 8 years, but I will do everything in my power to fight every day to challenge it as much as I can.
Well, Nora and David and Genevieve and Shawn, wherever you may be in the ether right now, I want to thank you for your great remarks today. They're both encouraging, but also with a very good dose of reality for the scope of what we all have to take on. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our hosts.
Thank you so very much. So from the Coronado Public Library, I really appreciate all of your time. This was a fantastic dialogue. If you were unable to or want to review what you've done, we have recorded this and it will be available on our YouTube channel to view for the next couple of weeks after this. Thank you again all for your time today. And this was a fantastic dialogue and I truly appreciate it.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone.
Good to see everyone. Have a wonderful day.